You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's November 1880 on the Baird farm in Perry, Illinois. John and Lavina Baird have gathered their family together for the Thanksgiving holiday. It's a special occasion. Their daughter, Mary Elizabeth Baird, has brought along a guest, a college boy she recently met named William. Last month, William won a debate contest and a $50 prize. He used his winnings to buy a ring, a garnet stone set in a simple gold band. He sent it to Mary and asked her if it would do. Mary said it would do just fine, provided her father approved. William is a deeply religious man, the chaplain of the Sigma Pi Literary Society. He wouldn't think of proposing without Mr. Baird's consent, so he's come to Perry, Illinois to ask her father's blessing. William, hand in hand with Mary, approaches Mr. Baird in the sitting room. Mr. Baird? Yes, son. William clams up as sweat drips down his brow. Mary gives his hand a comforting squeeze. William fights through his nerves. Mr. Baird, I've been reading Proverbs a good deal lately and find that Solomon says, "Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing, and obtaineth favor of the Lord." Mr. Baird sizes up the young man for a moment before offering a reply. Yes, I believe Solomon did say that. William sees an opening and is about to get to the heart of the matter, but Mr. Baird cuts him off. But Paul suggests that while he that marrieth doeth well, he that marrieth not doeth better. William's unsure of what to say. He looks to Mary for comfort, but she's just as tongue-tied as he is. Then suddenly inspiration strikes. With a confident but humble smile, William offers his retort. With respect, Mr. Baird, I believe Solomon would be the best authority on this point. And how's that, son? Paul was never married, while Solomon had a number of wives. Mr. Baird's face tightens. Mary's eyes go wide. The lump forming in William's throat couldn't be any bigger. But then a smile flashes across Mr. Baird's face. He gives William a friendly slap on the back and flashes a smile. Excellent point, young man. Mary Elizabeth Baird and William Jennings Bryan married 3 years later in October of 1884. Soon after their nuptials, Mary learned that she had to compete with William's other love, politics. After his undergraduate years as a chaplain, William would go on to attend law school and establish a successful law practice in Lincoln, Nebraska. He would serve in the House of Representatives from Nebraska's 1st District. He would rise to prominence and prestige in the Democratic Party, and he would stand as the Democratic nominee for president in the elections of 1896 and 1900. Though he would be soundly defeated both times, William Jennings Bryan was a man of unshakable faith and steadfast determination. In the 1908 contest, William would again secure his party's nomination. And on the campaign trail, he would preach the gospel of populism. But to win the election, he would need more than a hope and a prayer. Wicked Game is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's been especially busy around the studio this month. We launched a new podcast with another one coming, so trying to find the time to get everything done has been a challenge. There sometimes just aren't enough hours in the day, you know? But what if there was? What if someone gave you a 25th hour? How would you use it? You could sleep in. You could actually take a lunch maybe. You could go on a walk. I mean, this is the most precious, limited resource we have, time. A lot of us wish we had more time, but you need to ask, time for what? Do you know what's important to you and how to make it a priority? Therapy can help find what matters to you so you can do more of it. And as the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. But if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. Couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/elections today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/elections. Wicked Game is sponsored by Factor. It's been a busy month for me. We launched a new podcast with another one coming soon, all while keeping 6 others that we work on going strong. So I'll be frank, it's been stressful and time-consuming. What could be a perfect storm of conditions to ruin my healthy eating habits. It's so easy to go grab drive-thru, right? But I didn't, because there's Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit. Chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door, with over 35 different options every week to choose from, including keto, calorie smart, vegan, veggie, all the ways you want to eat healthy. And there's even more to enjoy, with over 55 nutrition-packed add-ons that'll help make your weekly meal planning even more delicious. And I'm dead serious when I tell you they hit the spot. Not only are they tasty, but satisfying, something you don't often get in nutritious food. Plus, it's all ready in just 2 minutes. No prep, no mess. Perfect for your most busy, stressful times, and all the rest, too. Head to factormeals.com/wickedgame50 and use code wickedgame50 to get 50% off. That's code wickedgame50 at factormeals.com/wickedgame50 to get 50% off. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. Democrat William Jennings Bryan had lost the 1896 and 1900 contests and lost big. In 1896, he lost by nearly 100 electoral votes. In 1900, he lost by nearly 150. Many Democrats were wary, therefore, of giving Bryan a third shot. Former President Grover Cleveland, in particular, was convinced that a Bryan nomination would ensure a Republican victory for President Teddy Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. On election night in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt had promised not to seek re-election in 1908. Almost immediately, he regretted that decision and later confided to a friend, "I would cut my hand off right there if I could recall that written statement." Teddy's promise on election night made him an instant lame duck president, and in some respects, it hampered his abilities to get things done in Washington. But it also freed him from any obligation to the conservative faction of the Republican Party and their supporters on Wall Street. After his election in 1904, Teddy pushed for many progressive reforms, earning him the label radical. But to carry forward Teddy's progressive legacy, his chosen heir, William Howard Taft, would have his work cut out for him. The Republican Party was largely split into 2 factions, those who supported Teddy's progressive reforms and those Wall Street conservatives who did not. In his efforts to appease both wings of the party, Taft would leave open the door for William Jennings Bryan to cast the election of 1908 as a contest between the status quo and populism, between the wealthy elite and the people. This is episode 31, 1908, Taft versus Bryan, a significant loser. It's a mid-August morning, 1906, at Fort Brown, a military outpost in Brownsville, Texas. A long line of black soldiers stand in formation outside the fort's main entrance. Across from these Buffalo soldiers, 2 armed Texas Rangers stare them down. Captain Bill McDonald and his nephew, Sergeant William McCauley. Captain McDonald steps forward, an automatic shotgun gripped tightly in his hands. "I demand to speak to the officer in charge of this garrison." The Buffalo soldiers don't move a muscle. They silently hold their position. Nervous, the captain's nephew whispers, "Captain, maybe we should call for backup." But his uncle, Captain McDonald, isn't interested in waiting for reinforcements. The local whites and Hispanics in Brownsville have had their differences over the years, but they agree on one thing: these black soldiers are a menace. Animosity has been building since the black troops arrived in Fort Brown back in July. A few days ago, the black troops retaliated with a raid on Brownsville, or so Captain McDonald believes. A white bartender was killed. A local policeman, Jose Dominguez, was shot, his arm amputated as a result. Captain McDonald's investigation revealed that these black troops are responsible. So he calls out again. "I have in my possession 12 warrants for members of this regiment, and I demand to speak to the officer in charge." But again, no response. The soldiers stand firm. "To hell with it." McDonald makes a beeline for the fort's entrance. His nephew calls out, "What are you doing?" "Stay if you want. I'm going inside." "Oh, God help us." McCauley nervously follows McDonald as he storms up to the gate. But the soldiers don't step aside. So McDonald and McCauley have to force their way through their formation. Just as they're about to break through, "Captain McDonald!" The two Rangers look up to find Major C.W. Penrose, commander of the 25th Regiment. "No sense charging hell with a bucket of water, Bill. Follow me." Inside the commander's office, Penrose and McDonald sit across from each other. As Penrose pours him a drink, McDonald gets right down to the business at hand. "On the order of the judge, you are to relinquish to me the 12 men in your possession. They are not in my possession, Captain. They are under my command, and I must refuse you. I have witnesses that prove they're guilty, Major. My men are innocent, Captain. On the night in question, every last one of them was present and accounted for." "Well, that's a lie. Mind your tone, Captain." Furious, McDonald angrily stands. "You defy the order of an officer of the court? I don't report to the courts. I report to my commanding officers, and they report to the President of the United States. I will not turn over my men. Will that be all?" Seeing no solution, Captain McDonald storms out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The Brownsville Affair, as it would come to be called, put Teddy Roosevelt in the position of serving as judge, jury, and punisher. After the Brownsville raid, local residents in Brownsville blamed Major Penrose's regiment of Buffalo soldiers for a raid on their town. The Army conducted an investigation. It was overseen by Roosevelt's War Secretary and presidential heir, William Howard Taft. Even in the face of a total lack of evidence, the Army concluded that the soldiers were responsible. Teddy accepted the Army's findings. As punishment, Teddy ordered the entire regiment dishonorably discharged. Though only a handful of the soldiers were accused, Teddy dismissed all 167 members of the 25th Regiment. But this decision would cost him. It would leave a stain on his presidential legacy, and it would leave open the door for his political enemies to seize power. In late August of 1906, just a few weeks after the Brownsville incident, William Jennings Bryan, the 46-year-old former congressman from Nebraska, returned from a year-long world tour. He arrived in New York City just in time for a political rally at Madison Square Garden. Even 2 years before the National Democratic Convention, William Jennings Bryan was, for many, the presumptive nominee for his party. His presence in New York was greeted by what one modern writer called the greatest ovation ever given to a private American citizen. Since Bryan's departure on his world tour a year earlier, the political landscape had changed quite a bit. Journalists had done a commendable job of exposing corrupt corporations. Newspapers had exposed gross examples of the courts flouting the law for Wall Street's benefits. All across the country, the people were growing tired of the status quo. In Alabama, a Democrat had recently been elected governor on a promise to free the people from the alien and arbitrary rule of big business, specifically the mighty railroad industry. From the White House, Teddy Roosevelt had taken steps to curb big business, seeking stricter federal regulations over the railroad and meat industry, and making moves to ban corporate money from the political process. Though many conservative Democrats and Wall Street Republicans in Congress pushed back, Teddy's progressive posture made him popular with the people aligning for change. Still, his many missteps, including scandals like the Brownsville Affair, left chinks in his armor and served to weaken William Howard Taft's position for the upcoming election of 1908. Additionally, Teddy's push for progressive reforms had made him persona non grata on Wall Street. As president, Teddy had tried to strike a balance between labor and business. He was perpetually frustrated by this belief on Wall Street that I am a wild-eyed revolutionist. Though Wall Street thought him a radical, many progressives thought he was not radical enough. William Jennings Bryan sought to use this vulnerability to his advantage. If Teddy and Taft were playing for the middle, Bryan would play to the left. His first salvo would be on the question of the railroads, the most powerful industry in the country. So powerful that many wondered if the railroads, largely a public service, should be nationalized by the government. Shortly after arriving in New York, Bryan took a progressive position, telling reporters that the railroads must ultimately become public property and be managed by public officials in the interests of the whole community. If Bryan was trying to make room for progressives in the Democratic Party, he was running the risk of alienating conservative Democrats in the South, many of whom saw Bryan as a dangerous man with dangerous ideas. Like many Republicans in the North, most Southern Democrats did not support public ownership of the railroads. But unlike the Wall Street Republicans, their reasons were not purely financial. If railroads were made public, the government could infringe on their Jim Crow laws and force whites to share trains with blacks. This put Bryan in a tough spot. If he dug in his heels on the railroad question, he would alienate many in the South. and without a solid South behind his nomination, he could not win the election. But Bryan also feared that he could not beat William Howard Taft without stealing away a large chunk of progressive voters. Ultimately, Bryan went with the politically safe route and resolved not to die on the hill of the railroad question. Weeks later, at a gathering in Kentucky, he told a crowd of Democrats, "I have spoken for myself and for myself only." Bryan promised not to force public railroads into the party's platform. But his speeches in New York had clearly shown that Bryan wanted to take the traditionally conservative Democratic Party in a new direction. Meanwhile, one pro-Wall Street Republican wanted to move his party in a new direction as well, and sought to benefit from Teddy Roosevelt's handling of the Brownsville Affair to position himself as the Republican nominee. Ohio Senator Joseph Foraker was a politically ambitious man. He had had his eye on the White House as far back as the early 1900s. Initially, he had hoped to curry favor with President Roosevelt in hope of becoming Teddy's heir apparent. But when Teddy handpicked William Howard Taft, Foraker turned his back on the Roosevelt administration and cozied up instead to the fat cats on Wall Street. In the years leading up to the 1908 contest, Foraker had been looking for an opportunity to pounce on both Teddy and Taft. He found that opportunity in 1906 with the Brownsville Affair. Foraker had always been a strong advocate for civil rights. As a soldier during the Civil War, he had once said that he wanted the war to last until slavery is abolished and every colored man is made a citizen and is given precisely the same civil and political rights that the white man has. Still, Foraker's critics accused him of playing politics, of using the scandal to bolster his own nomination. Whatever his motivations, late in 1906, Foraker went on the attack. He pushed for a Senate investigation into the president's conduct, and he passed a resolution ordering War Secretary Taft to turn over all records related to the affair. Taft kicked and screamed, but was ultimately forced to comply. Teddy said little in public, but privately he was distraught. The timing of Foraker's investigation could not have been worse. Teddy was about to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American ever bestowed with that honor. The Brownsville Affair threatened to tarnish that achievement and his legacy. So in the winter of 1908, Teddy fought back. On December 19th, he delivered a special message to the Senate. In it, he stood by his actions in the Brownsville Affair and pointed to the Army's internal investigation. According to the Army's findings, the men were guilty, so Teddy did nothing wrong by punishing them. And in defending the punishment he doled out, Teddy pointed to the evidence and the droves of witnesses who testified to the horrific crimes committed by the soldiers. Teddy chose his words poorly, though, saying a blacker never stained the annals of our Army. Foraker had previously asserted that the dishonorable discharge was too harsh. Teddy insisted the punishment wasn't harsh enough, stating the proper punishment for mutineers and murderers such as those guilty of the Brownsville assault is death. Foraker's response to Teddy's message on the Senate floor was firm and convincing. The soldiers were innocent. There was no evidence against them. There weren't droves of witnesses. There were only 8, and all were bigots. Not only was Teddy Roosevelt wrong, but by dismissing the entire regiment on such flimsy grounds, the president had potentially violated the law. With his powerful rebuttal, Foraker declared war on Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Teddy was smart enough to see that the rift between him and Foraker threatened to split the party, and that split might cost William Howard Taft the nomination at the Republican National Convention, set to take place the following summer. So in January of 1907, Teddy launched another counteroffensive against Senator Foraker and his friends on Wall Street. This time, though, the battle would not be fought in Congress. Teddy would take the fight to another front. He would use the press to kill Foraker's momentum and put a nail in the coffin of his presidential ambitions. Wicked Game is sponsored by NetSuite. Here's some quick and easy math. The less your business spends on operations, on multiple systems, on delivering your product or service, the more profit you have and the more money you keep. But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more these days. So to reduce costs and the headaches associated with them, switch to NetSuite, the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, all into one platform and one source of truth. And with NetSuite, you'll also reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud, no hardware required, and accessible from anywhere. You cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because now you've got one unified business management suite. And you improve efficiency by bringing all of your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math for yourself. See how you'll profit with NetSuite this year. Now through April 15th, NetSuite is offering a one-of-a-kind flexible financing program. Head to netsuite.com/elections. That's netsuite.com/elections. netsuite.com/elections. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the Revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's January 1907 in Washington, D.C., in an opulent ballroom in the New Willard Hotel. President Teddy Roosevelt is the guest of honor at a meeting of the Gridiron Club, a prestigious society of journalists. Teddy sits at a long, narrow wooden table that runs the length of the room. The rest of the guests sit at tables that extend out at right angles off the main table so that the configuration resembles a gridiron. This meeting of the Gridiron Club is a who's who of statesmen, senators, and titans of business, men like J.P. Morgan, who sits just a few seats down from the president. Teddy is set to make a speech after dinner, and he barely pays attention to the hot plate of food in front of him. The man next to him notices, "Well, Mr. President, I can have the kitchen bring you something else if that's..." "I'm fine, Mr. Blythe." Teddy's in an especially foul mood tonight because Wall Street's favorite senator, Joseph Foraker of Ohio, also sits just a few feet away. Senator Foraker feels Teddy got the Brownsville Affair all wrong. He feels the evidence is scant and that many of the eyewitnesses are lying. And Foraker hasn't been shy about criticizing Teddy on the Senate floor or to the press. So Teddy stews with rage, his eyes fixed on Foraker. Hoping to lighten the mood, Mr. Blythe slides Teddy a party favor for the Gridiron Club guests. A small booklet of cartoons titled Who's Who. "And what's this?" "Oh, it's a silly thing, a book of caricatures, but it's good for a laugh." Teddy thumbs through the booklet until he comes across a sketch of himself. In it, the cartoon Teddy writes a speech with his right hand and shoots a bear with his left, while kicking a black man while he's down. It's a direct shot at Teddy's actions related to the Brownsville Affair, and the implication is clear. Teddy is no friend of the black man. Blythe can tell Teddy is none too happy with his depiction. "It's all in good fun, Mr. President. It's not meant to be taken seriously." But Teddy doesn't like the joke. He angrily flips through the booklet until he comes across a sketch of Senator Foraker. In it, the cartoon Foraker is wooing two smiling black voters. Underneath is a crude set of lyrics that starts, "All coons look alike to me." It's a jab at Senator Foraker, implying that he doesn't really care about black Americans. He's just using them as a political tool to bolster his presidential prospects. Teddy doesn't take any comfort in the jab at Foraker. He's furious at the insinuation that he's a racist. But in the cartoon, Teddy does see a political opportunity. He leans over to Mr. Blythe. "I'd like to say a few words to these gentlemen. Right now." Blythe can see Teddy means business. He orders the waitstaff to pause dinner service. Then Blythe stands and quiets the room. Gentlemen, the President of the United States." Teddy stands. He's tired of Foraker attacking him. He's tired of being called a racist, and he's tired of Wall Street calling him a radical. As he takes the floor, Teddy decides that enough is enough. "Do you see this, gentlemen?" Teddy gestures to the row of Wall Street men sitting on a long table beside him. "Looks like a millionaire's row to me." Teddy stares down J.P. Morgan and the rest. "If you gentlemen are not prepared to accept the actions of my administration, which is ready to afford protection alike to the rich and the poor, I will say to you now that you will find yourself face to face with a mob, which has no respect for you or your riches." The room falls deadly silent, but Teddy is just getting started. "Now, about this investigation into my presidency. I tell you, it's purely academic. There's no substance to it at all. I acted properly. Congress has no right to challenge me." Teddy holds up the sketchbook for all to see. "J.B. Foraker says all coons look alike to me, does he? Well, I say they do not all look alike to me. Teddy slams down the pamphlet in anger, then goes on a tirade that lasts half an hour. He defends his actions and attacks Senator Foraker for politicizing the Brownsville Affair. Then he takes his seat victoriously. Traditionally, no one speaks after the President of the United States, so Teddy assumes the last word is his. But he's shocked when Mr. Blythe rises and says, "Thank you, Mr. President. I see the hour for bloody sarcasm has arrived, so I take the liberty of calling upon Senator Foraker for some remarks." The crowd applauds as Senator Foraker takes the floor. "Though I must admit I am embarrassed to follow President Roosevelt. As I have been singled out by name and action, I have no choice but to respond. No one in this country ever loved the president more than I did. That was when he was in the right. In the wrong, though, I have opposed him and will always do so. That is the way I see my duty to my conscience, my constituents, and my country. I would remind the president that no one is above the law and no one is beneath it. I would say that in the spirit of the 14th Amendment." Foraker pauses, stares Teddy straight in the eyes. "All persons look alike to me." Teddy Roosevelt and Senator Foraker went back and forth all night. Dinner service never resumed, and the meeting was adjourned at midnight. Given that the exchange took place in front of a room full of journalists, it's not surprising that it made headlines. The next day, the Foraker-Roosevelt standoff was the talk of Washington. Hearings for the Brownsville Affair began a week later and lasted well over a year. In the end, the Military Affairs Committee would side with Teddy, but history would not. The Brownsville Affair remains a stain on Teddy's presidential legacy. Nearly 70 years after the fact, the Army reinvestigated the incident. The Buffalo soldiers were cleared of all wrongdoing. At the gridiron dinner, Teddy did his best to defend himself against charges of racism. Senator Foraker did his best to defend himself against suggestions that he was politicizing the Brownsville Affair. But perhaps the real winner of the Roosevelt-Foraker incident was William Howard Taft. Taft was present at the dinner that night and was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. Throughout the Brownsville Affair, Taft, as War Secretary, had done his duty and followed Teddy's orders, but he had also kept his hands clean of the scandal. Taft had privately tried to reverse the discharges of the black soldiers. He had sought a proper rehearing of the evidence. He had even pointed out to Teddy that some of the eyewitness statements were in conflict. Though this was not public knowledge, it was proof to party insiders that Taft was a loyalist. And unlike Foraker, he was not beholden to Wall Street. After the Roosevelt-Foraker incident, Taft's path to the White House was free and clear, assuming, of course, that Teddy Roosevelt didn't want another term. Teddy had publicly promised not to seek renomination in 1908. But if he had wanted it, there would have been little resistance. Teddy was young, still in his 40s, a man with boundless energy. As one Republican told the press, "I know that the president does not want the nomination. Of course, if the convention should nominate him, he would have to take it." And when pressed on the question of another term, Teddy himself had once said, "Now don't let us have any of that damn nonsense. When I made that declaration on the night of my election, I knew what I was about." Mostly, Teddy was ready to leave the White House behind, perhaps to return to a military command or to spend his days hunting big game on an African safari. William Howard Taft would be the next Republican nominee, and in the lead-up to the convention, most delegates agreed. But deep down, Taft did not want the White House either. He had his sights set on another post, the Supreme Court. Days before the Republican convention, Taft told a Republican senator, "If your friend Chief Justice Fuller should retire and the president should send me a commission as Chief Justice, I would take it." The Republican National Convention began on June 16, 1908 at the Chicago Coliseum. Taft did not attend, choosing to remain in Washington in his office at the War Department. Teddy worked from his office in the West Wing. But throughout the convention, the two men stayed in close communication with each other and with the delegates in Chicago. A few days into the convention, Chairman Henry Cabot Lodge made a speech praising Teddy Roosevelt, a man he called the most popular man in the United States today. At the sound of his name, the 10,000-plus attendees broke into spontaneous chants, "4 more years, and we want Teddy." The cheering lasted for 49 minutes. Teddy knew that 4 more years would be impossible. He would later write that it was absolutely necessary that I should not be nominated. If I had accepted, my power for useful service would have forever been lessened. because nothing could have prevented the wide diffusion of the impression that I had not really meant what I had said, that my actions did not really square with the highest and finest code of ethics. And if there is any value whatever in my career, as far as my countrymen are concerned, it consists in their belief that I have been both an efficient public man and at the same time a disinterested public servant. Prior to the convention, the Washington Post had written, "There is but one man who can prevent the Republican Party from nominating Theodore Roosevelt, and that man is Theodore Roosevelt." So Teddy quietly instructed party leaders to squash any efforts to nominate him. When William Howard Taft's name was finally brought forward, the crowd again erupted in cheers. Taft's wife, Helen, remarked back in Washington, "I only want it to last more than 49 minutes. It lasted for half an hour, but still Taft was Teddy's man, and in the end, the delegates came through. Taft was nominated with over 700 votes. Senator Foraker received only 16. But the real surprise at the convention centered around the choice for Taft's running mate. On that front, Wall Street scored a victory with veteran Congressman James Sherman of New York, a big business conservative. The 1908 Republican Convention was the first time in American history that a political party used a preference primary, a process where voters directly decided the presidential nominee of their party. The introduction of the primary system had largely been the work of the progressive movement. Over the course of the early 1900s, the states had moved away from the top-down convention model and towards the primary model, a system progressives felt was more democratic. In these preference primaries, convention delegates were required to vote for the candidate who had won the primary election in their state. Critics, though, accused Teddy Roosevelt of scheming behind the scenes to fix the outcome. One scorned presidential hopeful said, "No administration in the history of this government ever gave a more flagrant example of political control of delegates than was brazenly flaunted in the face of the public at the convention of 1908. Still, in the eyes of most Republicans, the Taft-Sherman combination was a unity ticket. Taft, with his backing from Teddy Roosevelt, would make the more progressive wing of the party happy. Sherman would pacify the conservatives. And with a unified Republican Party, Democrats would have their hands full come November. As they geared up for their Democratic National Convention in July of 1908, William Jennings Bryan would seek to unite his party behind the idea that the Taft-Sherman alliance was the Wall Street ticket, and that Bryan was the candidate of the people. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. Going into the Democratic Convention in July of 1908, William Jennings Bryan's greatest challenge was not securing his party's nomination. It was overcoming Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy's decision not to stand in the 1908 contest had been a political blunder, but it had also freed him from the shackles of kowtowing to Wall Street and caving to the conservatives in his party. Throughout 1907, Teddy had moved the needle on progressive reform. He had attacked stock manipulators on Wall Street and lambasted the courts for not standing up to big business. He had gone after shady trusts and endorsed labor reforms like workers' compensation and shorter work hours. Much of this was political territory Bryan was trying to carve out for himself. And though Bryan wasn't technically running against Teddy Roosevelt, in a sense, he was running against his legacy. As Bryan said, "I find it very difficult to be partisan now, for if I make a straight-out Democratic speech, the first thing I know, the president makes one of the same kind, and then the subject immediately becomes nonpartisan." So instead of contending with Teddy, Bryan had tried his best to keep the conversation focused on Taft, a man who was far less bulletproof. Throughout the spring of 1908, Bryan's campaign, spearheaded by his brother Charles, had been relentless. Bryan and his brother had drafted countless reform proposals, initiatives Taft would never back. Bryan also made multiple overtures to organize labor and had fought to get the unions on his side. In addition, Bryan owned, edited, and published The Commoner, a weekly newspaper in Lincoln, Nebraska with a vast readership. Throughout the spring, Bryan had made a weapon of The Commoner, amplifying his message and using the paper to trounce William Howard Taft, a man he portrayed as a Wall Street sellout. Bryan's efforts paid off. On July 11, 1908, William Jennings Bryan secured the Democratic Party's nomination on the first ballot with a massive proportion of votes, almost 90%. The following day, the future Indiana Senator John Kern was elected as his running mate. The Democratic platform was a reflection of Bryan's populist ideas, but the Democratic Party was not entirely united behind the Bryan-Kern ticket. Bryan, a Nebraska politician, did little to inspire Southern voters, many of whom were still wary over his calls for government control of the railroads. Southern Democrats saw publicly controlled railroads as a recipe for one thing: forced desegregation. So as the 1908 campaign got underway in earnest, Bryan sought to assuage the concerns of white voters in the South by relying on his strongest political attribute, his gift with words. It's September 15, 1908, at the fairgrounds in Roanoke, Virginia. William Jennings Bryan sits in a chair on a platform in front of an immense crowd, the largest gathering in the history of Southwest Virginia. The governor of Virginia takes the podium and introduces the man they've all come to see. "It is my honor and privilege to present your nominee for president, Congressman William Jennings Bryan." Bryan walks to the podium looking tall, lean, and handsome. He projects the image of a devout man with a strong faith, and his powerful voice lends credence to that image. Bryan addresses the crowd. "Democracy is a doctrine that appeals to the hearts of men. That is why the Democratic Party lives on, whether it wins or loses." And of course, Bryan knows all about losing. He's lost 2 presidential contests, in 1896 and 1900. It's been almost 16 years since a Democrat won a presidential election. But Bryan offers the large crowd of Democrats something they haven't felt in a long time: hope. Today, Democrats should feel full of optimism, because Americans understand democracy better today than ever before. Bryan then turns his speech to another subject: Republican corruption. But he doesn't use incendiary rhetoric. He makes an eloquent, spiritual appeal. "I am willing to go down on my knees and ask my Heavenly Father, give us this day our daily bread. But I am not willing to make millions of my countrymen go down on their knees and say to some trust magnate, give us this day our daily bread, and have him reply, I will if you vote the ticket I want you to vote. In the impending campaign, we will challenge the Republican Party's platform, and we will state ours boldly. You cannot regulate a private monopoly. You cannot waste time trying to restrain it. You must kill it outright." As the crowd goes wild, Bryan gets to the heart of the matter. He addresses an issue that many in the South are deeply concerned about: his position on the railroads. 2 years ago, it has been said of me that I reached the conclusion that government ownership of the railroads was the only solution to the question. Busting monopolies is one thing, but giving the federal government control over the railroads is another. The people in this crowd do not want to be forced to share rail cars with black Americans. Triggered by the mention of the railroad, the crowd begins to turn. But Bryan presses on. "Have no fear, Virginia. My position on this question has been misconstrued and misstated, so let me state my position now. Government ownership of the railroad is out of the question. It is a path fraught with danger. I am now, as I have always been, a believer in the democratic doctrine of local self-government." With his daily bread speech in September of 1908, William Jennings Bryan hoped to convince the people of the South that his fight against big business would not come at the expense of Jim Crow. His words were printed in newspapers across the country, and as he continued to court the South, he also turned his attention to winning over the American worker and solidifying himself as the candidate for the American labor movement. And thanks to an aggressive effort by the Bryan campaign, the American Federation of Labor, a powerful group of labor unions, backed William Jennings Bryan, marking the first time the AFL ever endorsed a presidential candidate. Getting the AFL's support was no small feat, and with its 2 million members in his corner, Bryan was starting to look like a real contender. Bryan was relentless. In the 1908 contest, he mounted a tireless campaign backed by a popular slogan, "Shall the people rule?" Bryan launched a series of aggressive campaign tours. On the trail, he promised to attack trusts and restrict the power of big business, to fight for labor, to lower tariffs, and to make elections more democratic by allowing the people to vote directly for their senators instead of leaving it up to state assemblies. Bryan painted himself as a true progressive, and he painted Taft as the candidate of the wealthy elite. William Howard Taft was not blind to the threat posed by Bryan. Taft was a reluctant candidate. He would have preferred to hold out for a Supreme Court nomination, but his wife convinced him that declining a bid for the presidency was out of the question. Taft once bemoaned, "I hate politics." He especially hated making political speeches. After winning the nomination, he complained that the 1908 contest would be a kind of nightmare for me. But after Bryan secured the endorsement of the AFL, Taft had no choice but to hit the road and fight. The 1908 contest was arguably the first election in U.S. history where both candidates actively stumped for themselves. And Taft had a lot to brag about. After a brief financial scare in 1907, the economy was thriving. Taft had the endorsement of most major newspapers and the financial backing of Wall Street. But the biggest feather in Taft's cap was the backing of Teddy Roosevelt. Many joke that Taft's political platform could have been summed up in 4 words: take advice from Teddy. Bryan dared Teddy to stay out of the campaign, saying Teddy should let his man and me fight it out before the people. Late in the campaign, when Bryan was asked what he thought Taft believed, Bryan said he didn't know, and that Taft didn't either. He'd have to ask Teddy first. But in the end, despite Bryan's heroic efforts, it was Teddy's influence that proved more potent than Bryan's populism. Bryan's third and final presidential campaign ended in defeat, and his biggest one yet. Bryan lost by over 2 million popular votes. He won only 16 states and a meager 162 electoral votes. Teddy's prestige had carried the election soundly for his friend and colleague, William Howard Taft. On March 4, 1909, Taft was sworn in as America's 27th president, but a severe blizzard put a damper on the proceedings. The Capitol was hit by one of the worst ice storms in D.C.'s history. On the day of the inauguration, Taft joked to Teddy Roosevelt, "I always said it would be a cold day in hell when I got to be president." While William Jennings Bryan's final campaign in 1908 was a failure, it was not without significance. Bryan's populist appeal to the American worker pulled the Democratic Party out of the political dark ages and into the era of progressivism. Democrats had long been a conservative party that reviled any form of government intervention. Bryan's campaign moved the party left. He had opened the door for future Democrats to make appeals to labor and to speak to the American people's fears that big business was strangling them. It might be said that through his defeat in 1908, William Jennings Bryan laid the groundwork for the rise of a new leader in the progressive movement, Democrat Woodrow Wilson. In the 1912 contest, Wilson would seek to ride the wave of progressive politics all the way to the White House and to deny William Howard Taft his chance at 4 more years. To get the best of Wilson and win a second term, Taft would first have to win his party's nomination from the very man who helped put him in the White House. In 1912, Teddy and Taft would turn from friends to foes. This is episode 31 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1908, A Significant Loser. On the next episode, the election of 1912. As William Howard Taft fights Teddy Roosevelt for control of the Republican Party, Democratic hopeful Woodrow Wilson seeks to ride a growing wave of progressivism all the way to the White House. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details. And while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Election's Wicked Game is an Airship production. Hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound designed by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and CL Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
We all love pop culture, but you know what? It can be exhausting. And you know what there isn't enough of is actually funny working comedians talking about all the stuff that we love. And, to be honest, love to hate. From what's trending online with celebrities to what's trending online, well, because TikTok told us so. Hi, guys. I'm comedian Justin Martindale, the host of the Just Saying podcast with Justin Martindale on the Comedy Store Network, the mecca of comedy. And each week, I sit down with some of the funniest people you know, and we talk about all of the things happening right now in pop culture. And we have the best guests, from Leslie Jones to Katya to Zainab Johnson and Pete Holmes. We have them all. We break down the hottest stories, the drama, and are unafraid doing so and say what everybody else is thinking. Just Saying with Justin Martindale, coming to you live on the Sunset Strip from the Comedy Store in West Hollywood. So check us out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you there. You won't be disappointed. Just saying.